Jazeera, the most important news channel in the Arab world, was harshly criticized by high U.S. officials for having emphasized civilian casualties during the destruction of Fallujah. The problem of independent media was later resolved when the channel was kicked out of Iraq in preparation for free elections. Turning beyond the U.S. mainstream, we discover also that Dr. Sami al-Jumaili described how U.S. warplanes bombed the Central Health Center in which he was working, killing 35 patients and 24 staff. His report was confirmed by an Iraqi reporter for Reuters and the BBC, and by Dr. Ayman al-Ani of Fallujah General Hospital, who said that the entire health center, which he reached shortly after the attack, had collapsed on the patients. The attacking forces said that the report was unsubstantiated. In another gross violation of international humanitarian law, even minimal decency, the U.S. military denied the Iraqi Red Crescent access to Fallujah. Sir Nigel Young, the chief executive of the British Red Cross, condemned the action as hugely significant. It sets a dangerous precedent. He said the Red Crescent had a mandate to meet the needs of the local population facing a huge crisis. Perhaps this additional crime was a reaction to a very unusual public statement by the International Committee of the Red Cross, condemning all sides in the war in Iraq for their utter contempt for humanity. In what appears to be the first report of a visitor to Fallujah after the operation was completed, Iraqi doctor Ali Fadhil said he found it completely devastated. The modern city now looked like a city of ghosts. Fadhil saw few dead bodies of Iraqi fighters in the streets. They had been ordered to abandon the city before the assault began. Doctors reported that the entire medical staff had been locked into the main hospital when the U.S. attack began, tied up under U.S. orders. Nobody could get to the hospital, and people were bleeding to death in the city. The attitudes of the invaders were summarized by a message written in lipstick on the mirror of a ruined home. Fuck Iraq and every Iraqi in it. Some of the worst atrocities were committed by members of the Iraqi National Guard, used by the invaders to search houses, mostly poor Shias from the south, jobless and desperate, probably fanning the seeds of a civil war. Embedded reporters arriving a few weeks later found some people trickling back to Fallujah, where they enter a desolate world of skeletal buildings, tank-blasted homes, weeping power lines, and severed palm trees. The ruined city of 250,000 was now devoid of electricity, running water, schools, or commerce, under a strict curfew, and conspicuously occupied by the invaders who had just demolished it, and the local forces they had assembled. The few refugees who dared to return under tight military surveillance found lakes of sewage in the streets, the smell of corpses inside charred buildings, no water or electricity, long waits and thorough searches by U.S. troops at checkpoints, warnings to watch out for landmines and booby traps, occasional gunfire between troops and insurgents. Half a year later came perhaps the first visit by an international observer, Joe Carr of the Christian Peacemakers team in Baghdad, whose previous experience had been in the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories. Arriving on May 28th, he found painful similarities. Many hours of waiting at the few entry points, more for harassment than for security. Regular destruction of produce in the devastated remains of the city, where food prices have dramatically increased because of the checkpoints. Blocking of ambulances transporting people for medical treatment, and other forms of random brutality familiar from the Israeli press. The ruins of Fallujah, he wrote, are even worse than Rafah in the Gaza Strip, virtually destroyed by U.S.-backed Israeli terror. The United States has leveled entire neighborhoods, and about every third building is destroyed or damaged. Only one hospital with inpatient care survived the attack, but access was impeded by the occupying army, leading to many deaths in Fallujah and rural areas. Sometimes dozens of people were packed into a burned-out shell. Only about a quarter of families whose homes were destroyed received some compensation, usually less than half of the cost for materials needed to rebuild them. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Jean Siegler, accused U.S. and British troops in Iraq of breaching international law by depriving civilians of food and water in besieged cities as they try to flush out militants in Fallujah and other cities attacked in subsequent months. U.S.-led forces cut off or restricted food and water to encourage residents to flee before assaults, he informed the international press, using hunger and deprivation of water as a weapon of war against the civilian population in flagrant violation of the Geneva Conventions. The U.S. public was largely spared the news. Even apart from such major war crimes as the assault on Fallujah, there is more than enough evidence to support the conclusion of a professor of strategic studies at the Naval War College that the year 2004 was a truly horrible and brutal one for hapless Iraq. Hatred of the United States, he continued, is now rampant in a country subjected to years of sanctions that had already led to the destruction of the Iraqi middle class, the collapse of the secular educational system, and the growth of illiteracy, despair, and anomie that promoted an Iraqi religious revival among large numbers of Iraqis seeking succor in religion. Basic services deteriorated even more than they had under the sanctions. Hospitals regularly run out of the most basic medicines. The facilities are in horrid shape, and scores of specialists and experienced physicians are leaving the country because they fear they are targets of violence or because they are fed up with the substandard working conditions. Meanwhile, religion's role in Iraqi political life has ratcheted steadily higher since U.S.-led forces overthrew Mr. Hussein in 2003, the Wall Street Journal reports. Since the invasion, not a single political decision has been made without Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani's tacit or explicit approval, say government officials, while the formerly little-known young rebel cleric, Muqtada al-Sadr, has fashioned a political and military movement that has drawn tens of thousands of followers in the south and in Baghdad's poorest slums. Similar developments have taken place in Sunni areas. The vote on Iraq's draft constitution in fall 2005 turned into a battle of the mosques, with voters largely following religious edicts. Few Iraqis had even seen the document because the government had scarcely distributed any copies. The new constitution, the Wall Street Journal notes, has far deeper Islamic underpinnings than Iraq's last one, a half-century ago, which was based on secular French civil law, and had granted women nearly equal rights with men. All of this has now been reversed under the U.S. occupation. The consequences of years of Western violence and strangulation are endlessly frustrating to civilized intellectuals, who are amazed to discover that, in the words of Edward Luttwak, the vast majority of Iraqis, assiduous mosque-goers and semi-literate at best, are simply unable to believe what for them is entirely incomprehensible, that foreigners have been unselfishly expending their own blood and treasure to help them. By definition, no evidence necessary. Commentators have lamented that the United States has changed from a country that condemned torture and forbade its use to one that practices torture routinely. The actual history is far less benign. But torture, however horrifying, scarcely weighs in the balance in comparison with the war crimes at Fallujah and elsewhere in Iraq, or the general effects of the U.S. and U.K. invasion. One illustration, noted in passing and quickly dismissed in the United States, is the careful study by prominent U.S. and Iraqi specialists published in the world's leading medical journal, The Lancet, in October 2004. The conclusions of the study, carried out on rather conservative assumptions, are that the death toll associated with the invasion and occupation of Iraq is probably about 100,000 people, and maybe much higher. The figures include nearly 40